Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mobbin coming at you again with another APUSH video. We're continuing looking at topic 8.10, the African American Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. Now, previously, we talked about how through the use of nonviolent protest marches, civil disobedience, boycotts, favorable court rulings, etc., and even presidential executive authority to enforce school integration, we're going to be seeing the civil rights movement have some major victories by the mid-1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, for some people, that might seem like the end of the story. Jim Crow is dead, voting rights are protected, equality has been attained, right off into the sunset, cue the credits, that's the end of the show. But that's going to be false. Because if you are African American in this country by the mid-1960s, yes, Jim Crow is dead. And yes, you now have a real right to vote. And yes, you're protected from discrimination in hiring. That's all true. But there's still the legacy of all of that discrimination of the past that you are still living with. If you are someone that's a middle-aged man and you were the victim of poor segregated schools, that you did not have the opportunity to have an opportunity to advance in work, you're still feeling the effects of that. You're still feeling the likely poverty of that. There's still, even with the Civil Rights Act, no provision to protect against discrimination in terms of housing. So you still had, for example, advertisements in the newspapers that would still say only whites apply. You still had that. You still had the reality of police brutality that was happening in African American communities. So you're still dealing with a lot of this discrimination on a social and economic level. And don't forget, virtually no representation in government as well. So understand that, the idea of actually truly having that equality, that hasn't been attained yet in the mid-1960s. But what has been attained is a real taste of that equality. Black America has now gotten a taste of what equality is supposed to look like, of what it's supposed to taste like. And once you get a taste of something that you want, you only want more of it. And of course, that is obviously well deserved. And in this case, Black Americans now getting that taste of equality are going to demand more. Not more gradually, not more eventually, not more for, one's kids or grandkids. We're talking about right now. We're talking about immediate equality. And this is where the civil rights movement starts to kind of move in divergent directions, because the question becomes, not in terms of, wanting this general sense of equality, but how do you achieve it and what does it look like? Prior to the mid-1960s, it seemed to be, at least on the surface, encapsulated in the attitudes and the rhetoric of Martin Luther King Jr. Something that focuses in on social integration and a willingness to let the past be the past and move to the future, and that kind of sentiments. But there's going to be other folks that are going to have other ideas, and one of these groups is going to be known as the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam will actually be founded in the late 1940s, but won't start to become, a real presence in the fight for civil rights until the early 1960s. Now, in contrast to Martin Luther King's, SCLC and, CORE and some of these other groups that talked about this idea of nonviolent, peaceful integration with whites, the Nation of Islam is going to have a very different origin story. Whereas, most of these civil rights leaders are going to be, Protestant ministers, usually Baptist, AME churches, stuff like that, including Dr. King. Obviously, the Nation of Islam is not a Christian organization. It's an Islamic organization, but it's not traditional Islam. It's a offshoot of Islam that was created separately in the United States by black Muslims, started by a man named Elijah Muhammad. Now, the Nation of Islam is going to be of the belief that white America cannot truly be trusted to ever give black people a fair shake. And therefore, you cannot try to achieve a truly integrated society. You're still fighting for equality under the law, equality and opportunity, but not social integration. And so what the Nation of Islam is proposing is a black separatist movement. And it is going to be grounded in the idea that only black America can help black America. And when black America asks, a lot of itself, then it will prosper. So the Nation of Islam has a lot of strict rules about personal behavior in terms of, abstinence from alcohol and, very conservative attitudes regarding sex and marriage and, very traditional conservative gender roles and all that kind of stuff. A demand to, look presentable, look, gentlemanly and appropriate, like you see these guys right here, suit and ties and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, though, a separate America for black Americans, not social integration. And this movement is going to start to pick up steam because another tenet of the Nation of Islam is not the idea of Martin Luther King's turn the other cheek if somebody wrongs you, if somebody harms you. Dr. King, basically believed that if a police officer, hits you, you just turn the other cheek. You do not hit back. The Nation of Islam is going to say, cop hits you, you have every right to hit back. And that's going to resonate for many black Americans that had been the victims of police brutality and white racial-based bias or violence, and believe that, why should I have to be victimized in my attempt to gain equality? So this is going to start to, as we get into the 1960s, get more and more popular. And probably the most famous member of the Nation of Islam is shown in this picture. If you have not figured out who this is right in the center, this was, in the 1960s and into the 1970s, the world heavyweight boxing champion. His birth name was Cassius Clay, but once he joined the Nation of Islam, he changed his name to Muhammad Ali. So yeah, in case you didn't know it, Muhammad Ali, for a number of years, was a member of the Nation of Islam. And even though Muhammad Ali is going to be probably the most famous member of the Nation of Islam, he will not be the face of the Nation of Islam, and he will not be the chief spokesperson of the Nation of Islam. Rather, it will be this man right here. This is Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X is a really interesting story. If you ever get a chance to read his autobiography, it is an amazing story of talking about the realities of racism and segregation, not in the Jim Crow South like we normally think, but racism and segregation in reality in the North. Malcolm X never lived in the South. He was born in Nebraska, lived in Detroit, lived in Boston and New York City, and his experience is going to be different than what we normally think, but still, though, showing the realities of racism and discrimination and, in reality, segregation. Now, after a life of criminality in the late 40s and early 1950s, while in prison, Malcolm X will convert to the Nation of Islam and change his life forever. His, clear intelligence and ability to speak publicly will be able to win many supporters and converts for the Nation of Islam. And even though he didn't create the Nation of Islam, he wasn't ever the president of the Nation of Islam. He was, in essence, the name and the face of it as his spokesperson. And when we see Malcolm X, come on the scene by the early 60s, he's going to challenge Martin Luther King for leadership of the black civil rights movement. And he will criticize Dr. King publicly and repeatedly in the media basically describing Dr. King as a quote-unquote Uncle Tom, which, within the black community is one of the biggest slurs that you could hurl at somebody, basically saying that you as a black person are a sellout to white America. And the basic gist behind it is that, Dr. King is too soft on racists, that Dr. King has too many white people helping him in this fight for integration, which will never work. And he is asking black Americans to become victims and martyrs when they don't have to be. So you see this very different set of values and approaches and rhetoric for these two leaders, Dr. King and Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X is going to get in some hot water when Kennedy is murdered, and when he's asked about his thoughts about the death of President Kennedy, Malcolm X will respond by saying, that the chickens had come home to roost, in essence that, the evils of white America will also claim the life of white people just as much as it will black people. Now, this is going to really, really, really affect Malcolm X's popularity. In fact, the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, will actually kick him out of the group. And following him being suspended from the group and another falling out with the leadership, Malcolm X finds out that Elijah Muhammad's having a bunch of affairs, yada, yada, yada. Malcolm X leaves the Nation of Islam and begins his own personal search for faith, which actually takes him to Saudi Arabia for the Hajj. And he will come back with a renewed sense of what Islam means, and not the, separate notion of what Islam is from the Nation of Islam, but Islam from its origin. Bottom line, Malcolm X comes back a changed man, a man that's still fighting for civil rights for black America, no question about it, but is now willing to embrace notions of peace and is more open to embracing the idea of white America maybe not being purely evil, especially if any white folks happen to be Muslim. But before Malcolm X is going to really be able to have an impact in this new form, he will be murdered. And he will be assassinated by fellow members of the Nation of Islam. So one of the important voices of the civil rights movement will be snuffed out by members of his former organization. But nonetheless, it shows a bit of a rupture in, what the message is. And it does raise questions of, where does the civil rights movement go? Should it be more militant? Should it be more aggressive? Should it work with white America? These are going to be questions that are going to continue to be asked as the civil rights movement becomes even more fractured, as it becomes even more militant as the 1960s goes on. We'll touch on that next time. We'll see you.